The Alienist by Machado de Assis. How Itaguaí gained a house of prayer. The chronicles of the village of Itaguaí say that in remote times a certain doctor lived there, Dr. Simão Bacamarte, son of the nobility of the land and the greatest doctor of Brazil, Portugal, and Spain. He studied in Coimbra and Padua. At the age of 34, he returned to Brazil, as the king was unable to get him to stay in Coimbra, governing the university, or in Lisbon, handling the monarchy's business. Science, he said to his majesty, is my sole employment. Itaguaí is my universe. Having said that, he went to Itaguaí and devoted himself body and soul to the study of science, alternating healing with reading and demonstrating theorems with poultices. At the age of 40, he married Mrs. Evarista da Costa e Mascarenhas, a 25-year-old woman, widow of a judge from outside, and neither pretty nor pleasant. One of his uncles, a paca hunter before the eternal, and no less frank, was surprised by such a choice and told him so. Simão Bacamarte explained to him that Mrs. Evarista had first-rate physiological and anatomical conditions, digested easily, slept regularly, had a good pulse and excellent eyesight, was thus able to give him robust, healthy, and intelligent children. If, in addition to these gifts, the only ones worthy of a wise man's concern, Mrs. Evarista was poorly composed of features. Far from regretting it, he thanked God because he did not run the risk of neglecting the interests of science in the exclusive, petty, and vulgar contemplation of his wife. Mrs. Evarista lied to doctor's hopes. Bacamarte did not give him robust or moldy children. The natural nature of science is long-suffering. Our doctor waited 3 years, then 4, then 5. At the end of this time, he made an in-depth study of the subject, reread all the Arab and other writers he had brought to Itaguaí, sent consultations to Italian and German universities, and ended up advising his wife on a special diet. The illustrious lady, nourished exclusively with the beautiful pork from Itaguaí, did not heed her husband's admonitions. And to their resistance, explicable but unqualifiable, we owe the total extinction of the Bacamarte's dynasty. But science has the ineffable gift of healing all sorrows. Our doctor immersed himself entirely in the study and practice of medicine. It was then that one of its corners particularly caught his attention, the psychic corner, the examination of brain pathology. There was not a single authority in the colony, and even in the kingdom, on such a subject, which was barely explored or almost unexplored. Simão Bacamarte understood that Portuguese science, and particularly Brazilian science, could cover itself with unfading laurels, an expression used by himself, but in a burst of domestic intimacy. Outwardly, he was modest, as befits those in the know. The health of the soul, he cried, is the most worthy occupation of the physician. From the real doctor, added Crispin Soares, the town's apothecary and one of his friends and guests. The Council of Itaguaí, among other sins accused by chroniclers, had the sin of not paying attention to the insane. Thus it was that each furious madman was locked up in an alcove in his own house, and not cured, but neglected, until death came to defraud him of the benefit of life. The meek walked freely through the street. Simão Bacamarte immediately decided to reform such a bad custom. He asked the council for permission to house and treat all the insane people of Itaguaí and other towns and cities in the building he was going to build, in exchange for a stipend that the council would give him when the family of the sick person was unable to do so. The proposal aroused the curiosity of the entire village and met with great resistance, since it is true that it is difficult to eradicate absurd or even bad habits. The idea of putting madmen in the same house, living together, seemed in itself a symptom of dementia, and there were many who suggested it to the doctor's own wife. Look, Dona Evarista, Father Lopez, the local vicar, told her, see if your husband can take a trip to Rio de Janeiro. This business of always studying is not good. It turns into judgment. Mrs. Evarista was terrified, went to see her husband, and told him that she had desires, one in particular, to come to Rio de Janeiro and eat everything that seemed suitable for a certain purpose. But that great man, with the rare sagacity that distinguished him, penetrated his wife's intention and replied with a smile that she should not be afraid. From there, he went to the chamber, where the counselors were debating the proposal, and defended it with such eloquence that the majority decided to authorize what he had requested, voting at the same time for a tax intended to subsidize the treatment, accommodation, and maintenance of poor lunatics. The subject of tax was not easy to find. Everything was taxed in Itaguaí. After long studies, it was decided to allow the use of 2 plumes on horses during burials. Anyone who wanted to feather the horses of a funeral carriage would pay 2 tasteos to the council, with this amount being repeated as many times as the number of hours elapsed between the death and the last blessing at the tomb. The clerk got lost in the arithmetic calculations of the possible income from the new tax, and one of the counselors who did not believe in the doctor's company asked that the clerk be relieved of a useless job. The calculations are not accurate, he said, because Dr. Bacamarte doesn't fix anything. Who did you see now put all the crazy people in the same house? The worthy magistrate was mistaken. The doctor fixed everything. Once he received the license, he immediately began building the house. It was on Rua Nova, the most beautiful street in Itaguaí at that time. It had 50 windows on each side, a courtyard in the center, and countless cubicles for guests. As he was a great Arabist, he found in the Quran that Muhammad declares the insane venerable, considering that Allah takes away their judgment so that they do not sin. The idea seemed beautiful and profound to him, and he had it engraved on the frontispiece of the house. But as he was afraid of the vicar, and consequently of the bishop, he attributed the thought to Benedict VIII, deserving with this fraud, which was indeed pious, that Father Lopez should tell him, at lunch, about the life of that eminent pontiff. Casa Verde was the name given to the asylum, in allusion to the color of the windows, which appeared green for the first time in Itaguaí. It was inaugurated with immense pomp. From all the nearby and even remote towns and villages, and from the city of Rio de Janeiro itself, people rushed to watch the ceremonies, which lasted 7 days. Many insane people were already collected, and the relatives had the opportunity to see the paternal affection and Christian charity with which they were going to be treated. Mrs. Evarista, overjoyed with her husband's glory, dressed luxuriously, covering herself with jewels, flowers, and silks. She was a true queen in those memorable days. No one failed to visit her 2 or 3 times, despite the domestic and reserved customs of the century. And they not only courted her, but praised her, because, and this fact is a highly honorable document for the society of the time, because they saw in her the happy wife of a high spirit, of an illustrious man, and if they were envious of her, it was the holy and noble envy of her admirers. After 7 days, the public festivities expired. Itaguaí finally had a prayer house. 2. Torrent of madmen 3 days later. In an intimate expansion with the apothecary Crispim Soares, the alienist unveiled the mystery of his heart. Charity, sir. Soares certainly enters into my procedure, but it enters as a seasoning, as the salt of things, which is how I interpret St. Paul saying to the Corinthians, if I know all that can be known, and have not charity, I am nothing. The main thing in this work of mine at Casa Verde is to study madness in depth, its various degrees, classify its cases, and finally discover the cause of the phenomenon and the universal remedy. This is the mystery of my heart. I believe that by doing so I am providing a good service to humanity. An excellent service, corrected the apothecary. Without this asylum, continued the alienist, there was little he could do. It gives me, however, much more scope for my studies. Much bigger, added the other, and they were right. From all the neighboring towns and villages, madmen flocked to Casa Verde. They were furious, they were meek, they were monomaniacs, they were the whole family of the disinherited of the spirit. After 4 months, Casa Verde was a village. The first cubicles were not enough. A gallery of 37 more was added. Father Lopez confessed that he had not imagined the existence of so many mad people in the world, and even less the inexplicability of some cases. One, for example, was a coarse and villainous young man who every day after lunch would regularly deliver an academic speech, adorned with tropes antitheses, apostrophes, with its Greek and Latin embellishments, and its tassels of Cicero, Apuleius, and Tertullian. The vicar didn't want to stop believing. What? A boy he had seen 3 months earlier, playing shuttlecock in the street. I don't say no, the alienist replied, but the truth is what your reverence is seeing. This is every day. As for me, said the vicar, it can only be explained by the confusion of languages at the Tower of Babel. As Scripture tells us, probably languages having been confused in the past, it is easy to change them now, as long as reason does not work. That may in fact be the divine explanation of the phenomenon, agreed the alienist, after reflecting for a moment. But it is not impossible that there is also some human reason, and purely scientific, and that is what I am dealing with. Whatever it may be, and I am anxious. Really, there were 3 or 4 crazy people in love, but only 2 were surprising due to the curious nature of their delirium. The first, a falcon, a young man of 25, who thought he was a morning star, opened his arms and widened his legs to give them a certain appearance of rays, and remained like that for hours, forgetful, asking if the sun had already risen so he could go to bed. The other one was always walking around the rooms or the courtyard, along the corridors, looking for the end of the world. He was a wretch, whom his wife left to follow a scoundrel. As soon as he discovered their escape, he armed himself with a revolver and went after them. He found them 2 hours later, near a lake, and killed them both with the utmost cruelty. Jealousy was satisfied, but the avenged was mad. And then began that eagerness to go to the end of the world in search of the fugitives. The mania for grandeur had notable examples. The most notable was a poor devil, the son of a drunkard who narrated to the walls, because he never looked at anyone, his entire genealogy, which was this: God begot an egg, the egg begot the sword begot David, David begot the purple begot the duke begot the marquis begot the count, who is me. He would hit his forehead, snap his fingers, and repeat 5 or 6 times in a row. God created an egg, the egg, etc. Another of the same kind was a clerk, who sold himself as the king's steward. Another was a cattleman from Minas, whose habit was to distribute cattle to everyone. He would give 300 head to one, 600 to another, 1,000 and 200 to another, and it never ended. I am not speaking of cases of religious monomania. I will only mention one subject who, calling himself John of God, now claimed to be the God John and promised the kingdom of heaven to whoever worshipped him and the pains of hell to others. And after that, the graduate Garcia, who said nothing because he imagined that the day he came to utter a single word, all the stars would detach themselves from the sky and set the earth ablaze. Such was the power he had received from God. This is what he wrote on the paper that the alienist gave him, less out of charity than out of scientific interest. That, in truth, the alienist patience was even more extraordinary than all the manias hosted at Casa Verde. Nothing short of astonishing. Simão Bacamarte began by organizing an administrative staff, and, accepting this idea from the apothecary Crispim Sores, he also accepted 2 nephews, whom he entrusted with the execution of a regiment that he gave them, approved by the chamber, for the distribution of food and clothing, and so on in writing, etc. It was the best he could do, just to take care of his job. The greenhouse, he said to the vicar, is now a kind of world in which there is temporal government and spiritual government. And Father Lopez laughed at this peep, and added, with the sole purpose of also making a joke, leave it be, I'll have him denounced to the Pope. Once relieved of the administration, the alienist proceeded to a vast classification of his patients. He first divided them into 2 main classes, the furious and the meek. From there it passed to subclasses, monomanias, delusions, various hallucinations. This done, a careful and continuous study began. He analyzed the habits of each madman, the hours of access, the aversions, the sympathies, the words, the gestures, the tendencies. He inquired into the lives of the sick, their profession, customs, circumstances of the morbid manifestation, accidents in childhood and youth, illnesses of other kinds, family antecedents, an investigation, in short, such as the most astute magistrate would not do. And every day I noticed a new observation, an interesting discovery, an extraordinary phenomenon. At the same time, he studied the best regime, medicinal substances, curative means, and palliative means, not only those that came from his beloved Arabs, but also those that he himself discovered through diligence and patience. Now, all this work took up the best and most of his time. I barely slept and barely ate. And while still eating, it was as if he were working, because sometimes he would be interrogating an ancient text, sometimes he would be ruminating on a question, and he would often go from one end of dinner to the 3. God knows what he does. The illustrious lady, at the end of 2 months, found herself the most unfortunate of women. She fell into a deep melancholy, became yellow, thin, ate little, and sighed at every corner. She did not dare to make any complaint or reproach to him, because she respected him as her husband and master, but she suffered in silence and wasted away before our eyes. One day, at dinner, when her husband asked her what was wrong, she sadly replied that nothing. Then she dared a little, and went so far as to say that she considered herself as much a widow as before. And he added, "Who would have thought that half a dozen lunatics?" He didn't finish the sentence, or rather, she ended by raising her eyes to the ceiling. Her eyes, which were her most suggestive feature, black, large, bathed in a moist light, like those of dawn. As for the gesture, it was the same one she had used on the day Simão Bacamarte asked her to marry him. The chronicles do not say whether Mrs. Evarista brandished that weapon with the perverse intention of beheading science once and for all, or at least cutting off its hands. But the conjecture is plausible. In any case, the alienist did not attribute any other intention to him. And the great man was not angered, nor was he even dismayed. The metal of his eyes never stopped being the same metal, hard, smooth, eternal. Not even the smallest crease broke the surface of his forehead, as still as the water of Botafogo. Perhaps a smile opened his lips, through which filtered these words, soft as the oil of the canticle. "I consent that you go for a walk in Rio de Janeiro." Mrs. Evarista felt the ground beneath her feet disappear. Never of all the nevers had I seen Rio de Janeiro, which, although it was not even a pale shadow of what it is today, was nevertheless something more than Itaguaí. Seeing Rio de Janeiro, for her, was equivalent to the dream of the captive Hebrew. Now, especially, that her husband had settled down once and for all in that inland village. Now she had lost her last hopes of breathing the air of our good city, and it was precisely now that he invited her to fulfill her desires as a girl and a young woman. Mrs. Evarista could not hide her pleasure at such a proposal. Simão Bacamarte took her hand and smiled, a smile that was as much philosophical as it was conjugal, which seemed to convey this thought: there is no sure remedy for the pains of the soul. This lady is wasting away because it seems to her that I do not love her. I give her Rio de Janeiro, and she will be consoled. And because he was a studious man, he took note of the observation. But a dart pierced Mrs. Evarista's heart. He restrained himself. However, she simply told her husband that if he wasn't going, she wouldn't go either, because she wouldn't go out on the roads alone. "You will go with your aunt," replied the alienist. Note that Mrs. Evarista had thought about this very thing, but she had not wanted to ask for it or suggest it, firstly because it would have entailed great expenses on her husband, and secondly because it was better, more methodical and rational for the proposal to come from him. "Oh, but the money that will need to be spent," sighed Mrs. Evarista without conviction. "What does it matter? We have gained a lot," said the husband. "Just yesterday, the clerk gave me an account. Want to see?" And took her to the books. Mrs. Evarista was dazzled. It was a milky way of numbers. And then he took her to the chests where the money was. God, they were mountains of gold. They were 1,000 cruzados upon 1,000 cruzados, doubloons upon doubloons, was opulence. While she ate the gold with her black eyes, the alienist looked at her and said in her ear with the most perfidious of allusions, "Who would have thought that half a dozen lunatics?" Mrs. Evarista understood, smiled, and replied with great resignation, "God knows what he does." 3 months later the journey took place. Mrs. Evarista, The aunt, the apothecary's wife, his nephew, a priest whom the alienist had met in Lisbon and who had ended up in Itaguaí. 5 or 6 pages. For maids, such was the entourage that the population saw leaving there one morning in the month of May. The farewells were sad for everyone except the alienist. Although Mrs. Evarista's tears were abundant and sincere, they did not shake him. A man of science, and only of science, nothing dismayed him outside of science. And if anything worried him on that occasion, if he let a restless and police-like look run over the crowd, it was nothing more than the idea that some madman might be there mixed in with the sensible people. Goodbye. The ladies and the apothecary finally sobbed, and the procession set off. Crispin Soares, upon returning home, had his eyes between the 2 ears of the roan beast he was riding. Simão Bacamarte stretched his out over the horizon, leaving the horse responsible for the return. Vivid image of genius and vulgarity. One looks at the present, with all its tears and longing. The other looks at the future with all its dawns. For a new theory, while Mrs. Evarista, in tears, was searching for Rio de Janeiro, Simão Bacamarte was studying everywhere a certain bold and new idea, suitable for broadening the bases of psychology. All the time he had left over from taking care of the Casa Verde was not enough to walk in the street, or from house to house, talking to people about 30,000 subjects and punctuating his speech with a look that would scare the most heroic. One morning, 3 weeks had passed, while Crispin Soares was busy seasoning a medicine, someone came to tell him that the alienist had sent for him. "It's important business," he told me, added the bearer. Crispin turned pale. What important business could it be, if not some sad news from the entourage, and especially from the woman? Because this topic must be clearly defined, since the chroniclers insist on it. Crispin loved his wife, and for 30 years, they had never been separated for a single day. This explains the monologues he was now giving, and which his followers often heard. "Come on. Well done. Who told you to consent to Cesaria's trip? Flatterer, vile flatterer. Just to flatter Dr. Bacamarte. Now hold on. Come on, hold on, you lackey soul. Weakling, vile miserable. You say amen to everything, don't you? That's where you profit, you scoundrel." And many other ugly names that a man should not say to others, much less to himself. From here on, imagining the effect of the message is nothing. As soon as he received it, he gave up drugs and flew to Casa Verde. Simão Bacamarte received him with the joy of a wise man, a joy buttoned up to his neck with circumspection. "I'm very happy," he said. "News from our people?" The apothecary asked in a trembling voice. The alienist made a magnificent gesture and replied, "This is something higher. It is a scientific experiment. I say experience because I dare not assure my idea at this time. Nor is science anything else, sir. Soares, if not a constant investigation. It is, therefore, an experience, but an experience that will change the face of the earth. Madness, the object of my studies, was until now an island lost in the ocean of reason. I'm beginning to suspect it's a continent." He said this and fell silent to ponder the apothecary's astonishment. Then he explained his idea at length. In his concept, insanity covered a vast surface of brains, and developed this with a large copy of reasoning, texts, and examples. He found examples in history and in Itaguaí. But, as the rare spirit that he was, he recognized the danger of citing all the cases of Itaguaí, and took refuge in history. Thus, he pointed out some famous characters in particular. Socrates, who had a familiar demon, Pascal, who saw an abyss to the left, Muhammad, Caracalla, Domitian, Caligula, etc., a series of cases and people in which odious entities and ridiculous entities were mixed together. And because the apothecary was surprised by such promiscuity, the alienist told him that it was all the same thing, and even added sententiously, "Ferocity, sir. Soares, this is the real grotesque." "Gracious, very graceful," exclaimed Crispin Soares, raising his hands to the sky as for the idea of expanding the territory of madness. The apothecary found it extravagant, but modesty, the main adornment of his spirit, did not allow him to confess anything other than a noble enthusiasm, declared it sublime and true, and added that it was a case of chatter. This expression has no equivalent in modern style. At that time, Itaguaí, which like the other towns, villages, and settlements in the colony, did not have a press, had two ways of disseminating news, either through handwritten posters posted on the door of the town hall and the main church, or by means of a rattle. This is what this second use consisted of. A man was hired, for 1 or more days, to walk the streets of the town with a rattle in his hand. From time to time, he would ring his rattle, people would gather, and he would announce what he had been tasked with: a remedy for illnesses, some farmland, a sonnet, an ecclesiastical donation, the best scissors in the town, the most beautiful speech of the year, etc. The system had drawbacks for public peace, but it was preserved by the great energy of dissemination that it possessed. For example, one of the counselors, the one who had most opposed the creation of Casa Verde, enjoyed a reputation as a perfect trainer of snakes and monkeys, and in fact had never domesticated a single one of these animals. But I was careful to make the rattle work every month. And the chronicles say that some people claimed to have seen rattlesnakes dancing on the counselor's chest. Perfectly false statement, but only due to absolute confidence in the system. True. Not all the institutions of the old regime deserve the contempt of our century. There is nothing better than announcing my idea. It is putting it into practice, replied the alienist to the apothecary's insinuation. And the apothecary, not significantly disagreeing with this view, told him that yes, it was better to start with the execution. There will always be time to give it to the ratchet, he concluded. Simão Bacamarte reflected for a moment and said, "Assuming the human spirit is a vast shell, my end, sir. Source, let's see if I can extract the pearl, which is the reason. In other words, let us definitively demarcate the limits of reason and madness. Reason is the perfect balance of all faculties. Out of their insanity, and only insanity." Vicar Lopez, to whom he entrusted the new theory, declared plainly that he did not understand it, that it was an absurd work, and, if it was not absurd, it was so colossal that it did not deserve the beginning of execution. With the current definition, which is that of all times, he added, madness and reason are perfectly delimited. You know where one ends and the other begins. Why go over the fence? The vague shadow of an intention to laugh brushed over the alienist's thin, discreet lips, in which disdain was combined with commiseration, but no words came from his egregious entrails. Science was content to extend its hand to theology, with such certainty that theology finally did not know whether to believe in itself or in the other. Itaguaí and the universe were on the brink of a revolution. For a new theory, while Mrs. Evarista, in tears, was searching for Rio de Janeiro, Simão Bacamarte was studying everywhere a certain bold and new idea, suitable for broadening the bases of psychology. All the time he had left over from taking care of the Casa Verde was not enough to walk in the street, or from house to house, talking to people about 30,000 subjects and punctuating his speech with a look that would scare the most heroic. One morning, 3 weeks had passed, while Crispin Soares was busy seasoning a medicine, someone came to tell him that the alienist had sent for him. "It's important business," he told me, added the bearer. Crispin turned pale. What important business could it be, if not some sad news from the entourage, and especially from the woman? Because this topic must be clearly defined, since the chroniclers insist on it. Crispin loved his wife, and for 30 years, they had never been separated for a single day. This explains the monologues he was now giving, and which his followers often heard. "Come on. Well done. Who told you to consent to Cesaria's trip? Flatterer, vile flatterer. Just to flatter Dr. Bacamarte. Now hold on. Come on, hold on, you lackey soul. Weakling, vile miserable. You say amen to everything, don't you? That's where you profit. You scoundrel." And many other ugly names that a man should not say to others, much less to himself. From here on, imagining the effect of the message is nothing. As soon as he received it, he gave up drugs and flew to Casa Verde. Simão Bacamarte received him with the joy of a wise man, a joy buttoned up to his neck with circumspection. "I'm very happy," he said. "News from our people?" The apothecary asked in a trembling voice. The alienist made a magnificent gesture and replied, "This is something higher. It is a scientific experiment. I say experience because I dare not assure my idea at this time. Nor is science anything else, sir. Soars, if not a constant investigation. It is, therefore, an experience, but an experience that will change the face of the earth. Madness, the object of my studies, was until now an island lost in the ocean of reason. I'm beginning to suspect it's a continent." He said this and fell silent to ponder the apothecary's astonishment. Then he explained his idea at length. In his concept, insanity covered a vast surface of brains and developed this with a large copy of reasoning, texts, and examples. He found examples in history and in Itaguaí. But, as the rare spirit that he was, he recognized the danger of citing all the cases of Itaguaí and took refuge in history. Thus, he pointed out some famous characters in particular. Socrates, who had a familiar demon, Pascal, who saw an abyss to the left, Muhammad, Caracalla, Domitian, Caligula, etc., a series of cases and people in which odious entities and ridiculous entities were mixed together. And because the apothecary was surprised by such promiscuity, the alienist told him that it was all the same thing, and even added sententiously, "Ferocity, sir. Soars, this is the real grotesque." "Gracious, very graceful," exclaimed Crispim Soars, raising his hands to the sky as for the idea of expanding the territory of madness. The apothecary found it extravagant, but modesty, the main adornment of his spirit, did not allow him to confess anything other than a noble enthusiasm, declared it sublime and true, and added that it was a case of chatter. This expression has no equivalent in modern style. At that time, Itaguaí, which like the other towns, villages, and settlements in the colony, did not have a press, had two ways of disseminating news, either through handwritten posters posted on the door of the town hall and the main church, or by means of a rattle. This is what this second use consisted of. A man was hired, for 1 or more days, to walk the streets of the town with a rattle in his hand. From time to time he would ring his rattle, people would gather, and he would announce what he had been tasked with: a remedy for illnesses, some farmland, a sonnet, an ecclesiastical donation, the best scissors in the town, the most beautiful speech of the year, etc. The system had drawbacks for public peace, but it was preserved by the great energy of dissemination that it possessed. For example, one of the counselors, the one who had most opposed the creation of Casa Verde, enjoyed a reputation as a perfect trainer of snakes and monkeys, and in fact had never domesticated a single one of these animals. But I was careful to make the rattle work every month. And the chronicles say that some people claimed to have seen rattlesnakes dancing on the counselor's chest. Perfectly false statement, but only due to absolute confidence in the system. True. Not all the institutions of the old regime deserve the contempt of our century. There is nothing better than announcing my idea. It is putting it into practice, replied the alienist to the apothecary's insinuation. And the apothecary, not significantly disagreeing with this view, told him that yes, it was better to start with the execution. There will always be time to give it to the ratchet, he concluded. Simão Bacamarte reflected for a moment and said, "Assuming the human spirit is a vast shell, my end, sir. Soars, let's see if I can extract the pearl, which is the reason. In other words, let us definitively demarcate the limits of reason and madness. Reason is the perfect balance of all faculties. Out of their insanity, and only insanity." Vicar Lopez, to whom he entrusted the new theory, declared plainly that he did not understand it, that it was an absurd work, and, if it was not absurd, it was so colossal that it did not deserve the beginning of execution. With the current definition, which is that of all times, he added, madness and reason are perfectly delimited. You know where one ends and the other begins. Why go over the fence? The vague shadow of an intention to laugh brushed over the alienist's thin, discreet lips, in which disdain was combined with commiseration, but no words came from his egregious entrails. Science was content to extend its hand to theology, with such certainty that theology finally did not know whether to believe in itself or in the other. Itaguaí and the universe were on the brink of a revolution. The terror 4 days later. The population of Itaguaí heard with dismay the news that a certain Costa had been taken to Casa Verde. Impossible. How impossible was collected this morning. But in truth, he didn't deserve it. On top of that, after so much he did, Costa was one of the most esteemed citizens of Itaguaí. He had inherited 400,000 cruzados in good currency from King John V, money whose income was enough, according to his uncle's will, to live until the end of the world. He quickly collected the inheritance and began to divide it into loans without usury, 1,000 cruzados to one, 2,000 to another, 300 to this one, 800 to that one, to such an extent that at the end of 5 years, he was left with nothing. If misery came suddenly, Itaguaí's shock would be enormous. But it came slowly. He gradually went from opulence to abundance, from abundance to mediocrity, from mediocrity to poverty, from poverty to misery. After those 5 years, people who had taken their hats to the ground as soon as he appeared at the end of the street now patted him on the shoulder, with intimacy, flicked his nose, called him scoundrels. And Costa is always calm and smiling. He didn't even notice that the least courteous were precisely those who still had an outstanding debt. On the contrary, it seems that he embraced them with greater pleasure and more sublime resignation. One day, as one of these incurable debtors threw him a harsh joke, and he laughed at it, a disaffected person observed with a certain perfidy, "You put up with this guy to see if he pays you." Costa did not stop for a minute. He went to the debtor and forgave his debt. "No wonder," replied the other. "Costa gave up a star which is in the sky." Costa was perceptive. He understood that he denied all merit to the act, attributing to it the intention of rejecting what they did not put in his pocket. He was also punctilious and inventive. 2 hours later, he found a way to prove that he did not deserve such a label. He took some folds and loaned them to the debtor. Now, I hope that, he thought without finishing the sentence. This last statement by Costa persuaded believers and unbelievers alike. No one doubted the chivalrous feelings of that worthy citizen. The most modest needs went out into the streets, came knocking on his door with their old slippers, with their patched capes. A worm, however, gnawed at Costa's soul. It was the concept of disaffection. But that's all over. 3 months later, he came to ask him for 120 cruzados with a promise to return them within 2 days. It was the residue of a large inheritance, but it was also a noble revenge. Costa lent the money right away, without interest. Unfortunately, he didn't have time to get paid. 5 months later, he was taken to Casa Verde. One can imagine Itaguaí's dismay when he heard about the case. There was no talk of anything else. It was said that Costa had gone mad at lunch, others that it was early in the morning, and the outbursts were counted which were furious, dark, terrible, or gentle, and even funny, depending on the version. Many people ran to Casa Verde and found poor Costa calm, a little startled, speaking very clearly, and asking why they had taken him there. Some went to the alienist. Bacamarte approved of these feelings of esteem and compassion, but added that science was science, and that he could not leave an idiot out on the street. The last person who interceded for him, because after what I am about to tell, no one else dared to seek out the terrible doctor, was a poor lady, Costa's cousin. The alienist told him confidentially that this worthy man was not in perfect balance of mental faculties, in view of the way he had dissipated the wealth that— "No, not that, not that," interrupted the good lady energetically. "If he spent what he received so quickly, it's not his fault. No, no, sir. I'll tell you how the business went. My late uncle was not a bad man, but when he was furious, he was capable of not even taking his hat off to the Blessed Sacrament. Now, one day, shortly before he died, he discovered that a slave had stolen an ox from him. Imagine how it turned out. The face was a pepper. He was trembling all over. His mouth was foaming. Reminds me like it was yesterday. Then an ugly, hairy man in shirt sleeves came up to him and asked for water. My uncle, may God speak to his soul, replied that he should go drink from the river or go to hell. The man looked at him, opened his hand in a threatening manner, and cursed him. All your money will not last more than 7 years and a day. as sure as this is the Solomon bell. And he showed the Solomon bell printed on his arm. That was it, my lord. It was that curse of that damn guy. Bacamarte had stabbed the poor lady with a pair of eyes as sharp as daggers. When she had finished, he extended his hand politely, as if he were doing so to the viceroy's own wife, and invited her to go and speak to her cousin. The wretch believed. He took her to the greenhouse and locked her in the gallery of the hallucinated. The news of this treachery by the illustrious Bacamarte struck terror into the souls of the population. No one wanted to believe that, without reason, without enmity, the alienist would lock up in the Casa Verde a perfectly sensible lady who had no other crime than interceding for an unfortunate person. The case was talked about on street corners, at barbers. A romance was built, some courteous pleasantries that the alienist had once directed at Costa's cousin, Costa's indignation and his cousin's contempt. And then revenge. It was clear. But the alienist's austerity, the life of study he led, seemed to disprove such a hypothesis. Stories. All this was naturally the rogue's cover. And one of the most credulous ones even murmured that he knew other things. He didn't say them, because he wasn't completely sure, but he knew. He could almost swear. Who were close to him couldn't tell us what happened, what the reason was. Crispin's sores melted. This questioning of restless and curious people, of astonished friends, was for him a public consecration. There was no doubt. The whole town finally knew that the alienist's private person was him, Crispin, the apothecary, the collaborator of the great man and of great things. Hence the rush to the pharmacy. All this was said by the apothecary's jocular face and discreet laugh, the laugh and the silence, because he didn't answer anything. 1, 2, 3 monosyllables, at most loose, dry, covered in the faithful smile, constant and small, full of scientific mysteries, which he could not, without disgrace or danger, reveal to any human person. There's something thought the most suspicious. One of them just thought about it, shrugged and walked away. He had personal business. He had just built a sumptuous house. The house alone was enough to stop and call everyone. But there was more. The furniture, which he had brought from Hungary and Holland, he said, and which could be seen from outside because the windows were always open, and the garden, which was a masterpiece of art and taste. This man, who had become rich in the manufacture of saddlebags, had always dreamed of a magnificent house, a magnificent garden and rare furniture. He did not leave the saddle business, but rested from it in contemplation of the new house, the first in Itaguaí, grander than the Casa Verde, more noble than the Camara. Among the illustrious people of the town, there was weeping and gnashing of teeth when they thought of, or spoke of, or praised the house of the saddler. A simple saddler, for God's sake. There he is, dumbfounded, said passers-by in the morning. In fact, it was Mateus's custom to lie down in the middle of the garden, with his eyes on the house, in love, for a long hour, until they came to call him for lunch. The neighbors, although they greeted him with a certain respect, laughed behind his back, which was a pleasure. One of them even said that Mateus would be much more economical and would be very rich if he made the saddlebags for himself. Unintelligible epigram, but one that made everyone laugh out loud. Now, there's Matthew being contemplated, they said in the afternoon. The reason for this other saying was that in the afternoon, when families went out for a walk, they had an early dinner. Mateus would stand at the window, right in the center, showy against a dark background, dressed in white, in a stately manner, and he would stay like that for 2 or 3 hours until it got completely dark. It can be believed that Mateus' intention was to be admired and envied, since he did not confess it to anyone, neither the apothecary nor Father Lopez, his great friends. And yet the apothecary's claim was no different when the alienist told him that the saddler perhaps suffered from a love of stones, a mania that Bacamarte had discovered and studied for some time. That thing about looking at the house. No, sir, Crispin Soares replied quickly. No, you must forgive me, but perhaps you don't know that in the morning he examines the work, he doesn't admire it. In the afternoon, it is others who admire him and his work. And he recounted the use of the saddler every afternoon, from early morning until nightfall. A scientific voluptuousness lit up Simão Bacamarte's eyes. Either he did not know all the saddler's customs, or he wanted nothing more, in questioning Crispin, than to confirm some uncertain news or vague suspicion. The explanation satisfied him. But as he had the joys of a wise man, concentrated, the apothecary saw nothing that would make him suspect a sinister intention. On the contrary, it was afternoon, and the alienist asked for his arm so they could go for a walk. God, it was the first time that Simão Bacamarte gave his private person such an honor. Crispin was trembling, flustered. He said yes, he was ready. 2 or 3 people arrived from outside. Crispin mentally told them to go to hell. Not only did they delay the trip, but it could also happen that Bacamarte would choose one of them to accompany him and leave it to him. What impatience! What distress! Finally, they left. The alienist drove towards the saddler's house, saw him at the window, passed by 5, 6 times, slowly, stopping, examining his attitude, his facial expression. Poor Mateus! As soon as he noticed that he was the object of curiosity or admiration of the first figure from Itaguaí, redoubled his expression, gave another emphasis to his attitudes. Sad, sad, did nothing more than condemn himself. The next day, he was taken to Casa Verde. Casa Verde is a private prison, said a doctor without a clinic. Never has an opinion caught on and spread so quickly. Private imprisonment. This is what was repeated from north to south and from east to west of Itaguaí. With fear, it is true, because during the week that followed the capture of poor Mateus, 20 or so people, 2 or 3 of them of consideration, were taken to Casa Verde. The alienist said that only pathological cases were admitted, but few people believed him. Popular versions followed one another. Revenge, greed for money, God's punishment, the doctor's own monomania, Rio de Janeiro's secret plan to destroy any seed of prosperity in Itaguaí that might sprout, blossom, or flower, to the disgrace and poverty of that city. 1,000 other explanations that explained nothing. Such was the daily product of the public imagination. At that moment, the alienist's wife, his aunt, Crispin Sore's wife, and the entire entourage, or almost the entire entourage, that had left Itaguaí a few weeks earlier arrived from Rio de Janeiro. The alienist went to receive her, with the apothecary, Father Lopez, the counselors, and several other magistrates. The moment when Mrs. Evarista laid eyes on her husband is considered by the chroniclers of the time as one of the most sublime in the moral history of men, and this is due to the contrast of the two natures, both extreme, both egregious. Mrs. Evarista let out a scream, stammered a word, and threw herself at her husband, in a gesture that could not be better defined than by comparing it to a mixture of a jaguar and a turtle dove. Not so the illustrious Bacamarte. Cold as a diagnosis, without for an instant losing his scientific rigidity, he extended his arms to the owner, who fell into them and fainted. Short incident. After 2 minutes, Mrs. Evarista received greetings from her friends, and the procession set off. Mrs. Evarista was the hope of Itaguaí. She was counted on to alleviate the scourge of Casa Verde. Hence the public acclaim, the immense crowd that filled the streets, the pennants, the flowers and apricots in the windows. With her arm resting on Father Lopez, because the eminent Bacamarte had entrusted his wife to the vicar and was accompanying them at a meditative pace, Dona Evarista turned her head from one side to the other, curious, restless, petulant. The vicar asked about Rio de Janeiro, which he had not seen since the previous viceroyalty, and Mrs. Evarista responded, enthusiastically, that it was the most beautiful thing that could exist in the world. The Paseo Público was finished, a paradise where she had gone many times, and the Rua das Belas Noites, the Marica's fountain. The Marica's fountain. They were real ducks, made of metal and spewing water from their mouths. A very gallant thing. The vicar said yes, that Rio de Janeiro must be much more beautiful now. If it was already in another time. Not surprisingly, it was bigger than Itaguaí and also the seat of government. But it cannot be said that Itaguaí was ugly. There were beautiful houses, Mateus' house, Casa Verde. Speaking of Casa Verde, said Father Lopez, skillfully slipping into the subject of the occasion. "You find it very crowded." "Yes? In truth, there's Matthew." "The saddler?" "The saddler. There's Costa, Costa's cousin, and Fulano and Sacrano, and—" "All of this crazy?" "Or almost crazy," replied the priest. "But then?" The vicar turned down the corners of his mouth, in the manner of someone who knows nothing or doesn't want to say everything. Vague answer, which cannot be repeated to another person due to lack of text. Mrs. Evarista found it truly extraordinary that all those people were going crazy. One or the other go, but all? However, he found it hard to doubt. The husband was a wise man. He would not take anyone to the greenhouse without clear proof of madness. Without a doubt, the vicar was pointing out. 3 hours later, around 50 guests sat around Simão Bacamarte's table. It was the welcome dinner. Mrs. Evarista was the obligatory subject of toasts, speeches, verses of all kinds, metaphors, amplifications, apologues. She was the wife of the new Hippocrates, the muse of science, angel, divine, dawn, charity, life, consolation. He had 2 stars in his eyes, according to Crispin Soar's modest version, and 2 sons, according to a counselor. The alienist listened to these things somewhat wearily, but without visible impatience. At most he whispered in his wife's ear that rhetoric allowed such meaningless boldness. Mrs. Evarista made efforts to adhere to her husband's opinion. But even discounting 3/4 of the praises, there was still plenty to fill his soul with. One of the speakers, for example, Martin Brito, a 25-year-old boy, a complete dandy, well-versed in romance and adventures, gave a speech in which the birth of Mrs. Evarista was explained by the most singular challenges. "God," he said, "after giving the universe man and woman, this diamond and this pearl of the divine crown," and the speaker triumphantly dragged this phrase from one end of the table to the other. God wanted to defeat God and created Mrs. Evarista. Mrs. Evarista lowered her eyes with exemplary modesty. 2 ladies, finding the courtesy excessive and audacious, questioned the eyes of the owner of the house, and, in truth, the alienist gesture seemed to them clouded with suspicion, threats, and probably blood. The 2 ladies thought it was very bold, and one and the other asked God to remove any tragic episode, or to postpone it, at least until the next day. Yes, that he would postpone it. One of them, the most pious, even admitted to herself that Mrs. Evarista did not deserve any distrust, so far was she from being attractive or pretty. A simple warm water. The truth is, if all tastes were the same, what would become of yellow? And this idea made her tremble again, though less because the alienist was now smiling at Martin Brito, and, once everyone was up, he went to him and told him about the speech. He didn't deny to her that it was a brilliant improvisation, full of magnificent features. Was it his own idea regarding the birth of Mrs. Evarista, or had he found it in some author? No, sir, it was his own. He found it on that occasion, and it seemed to him suitable for an oratorical outburst. Besides, his ideas were bold rather than tender or jocular. It was epic. Once, for example, he composed an ode to the fall of the Marquis of Pombal, in which he said that this minister was the harsh dragon of nothingness, crushed by the avenging claws of the whole, and so on, more or less out of the ordinary. I liked sublime and rare ideas, grand and noble images. Poor boy, thought the alienist. And he continued, "It is a case of brain injury, a phenomenon without gravity, but worthy of study." Mrs. Evarista was astonished when she found out, 3 days later, that Martin Brito had been staying at Casa Verde. A boy who had such beautiful ideas. The 2 ladies attributed the act to the alienist's jealousy. It couldn't be anything else. The young man's statement was really too bold. Jealousy? But how can we explain that, immediately afterwards, Jose Borges do Cudo Lamy, a respectable person, Chico das Cambreas, an emeritus idler, the clerk Fabricio, and others were arrested? The terror intensified. It was no longer known who was sane or who was crazy. When their husbands went out, women would have a lamp lit for Our Lady. And not all husbands were brave. Some didn't go out without one or two henchmen. Positively terror. Those who could immigrated. One of these fugitives was arrested 200 paces from a village. He was a young man of 30, amiable, talkative, polite, so polite that he would not greet anyone without taking his hat to the ground. In the street, he would run a distance of 10 to 20 fathoms to go and shake the hand of a serious man, a lady, sometimes a boy, as it happened to the son of the judge outside. He had a vocation for courtesies. Moreover, he owed his good relations in society not only to his personal gifts, which were rare, but also to the noble tenacity with which he never lost heart in the face of 1, 2, 4, 6 refusals, ugly faces, etc. What happened was that, once he entered a house, he would never leave it, nor would the people in the house leave him. So gracious was Gil Bernard's. Because Gil Bernard's, despite knowing that he was esteemed, was afraid when one day they told him that the alienist had his eye on him. The following morning he fled the village, but was soon caught and taken to Casa Verde. We must put an end to this. You can't continue. Down with tyranny. Despot. Violent. Goliath. They weren't screams in the street. They were sighs at home, but soon it was time for... The terror grew. Rebellion was approaching. The idea of a petition to the government to have Simão Bacamarte captured and deported went through a few heads before the barber Porfirio put it out in the shop with great gestures of indignation. It should be noted, and this is one of the purest pages of this dark story, it should be noted that Porfirio, since Casa Verde began to be populated so extraordinarily, saw his profits grow due to the assiduous application of leeches that were requested from him. But private interest, he said, must yield to public interest. And he added, "We must overthrow the tyrant." It should be noted that he let out this cry precisely on the day that Simão Bacamarte had a man called Qualo, who was bringing a quest with him, brought to Casa Verde. "Won't you tell me what makes Qualo crazy?" shouted Porfirio, and no one answered him. Everyone repeated that he was a perfectly sensible man. The same lawsuit he brought with the barber, regarding some land in the village, was the result of the obscurity of a decree and not of greed or hatred. An excellent character, Qualo. The only people he disliked were some people who, claiming to be taciturn or claiming to be in a hurry, as soon as they saw him from afar they would turn corners, go into shops, etc. In truth, he loved a good talk, a long talk enjoyed in long sips, and that is why he was never alone, preferring those who knew how to say 2 words but not disdaining the others. Father Lopez, who cultivated Dante and was an enemy of Qualo, never saw him disconnect from a person who did not recite and amend this passage. La boca salivo dal fiero pasta quel secator. Asterisk, but some knew of the priest's hatred, and others thought that this was a prayer in Latin. 6. The rebellion, around 30 people, joined the barber, wrote, and took a representation to the chamber. The chamber refused to accept it, declaring that Casa Verde was a public institution and that science could not be amended by administrative vote, much less by street movements. "Get back to work," concluded the president, "is the advice we give you." The agitators' irritation was enormous. The barber declared that they were going to raise the flag of rebellion from there and destroy the Casa Verde. That Itaguaí could not continue to serve as a corpse for the studies and experiments of a despot. That many esteemed people, some distinguished, others humble, but worthy of appreciation, lay in the cubicles of the greenhouse. That the scientific despotism of the alienist was complicated by the spirit of greed, since the insane, or supposedly so, were not treated for free. The families, and in their absence the chamber, paid the alienist. "That's false," interrupted the president. "False? About 2 weeks ago, we received a letter from the illustrious doctor, in which he declared that, in order to carry out experiments of high psychological value, he would give up the stipend voted by the chamber and would also receive nothing from the families of the sick. The news of this act, so noble, so pure, suspended the rebels' souls a little. Surely the alienist could be wrong, but no interest outside of science instigated him, and to demonstrate the error something more was needed than riots and clamor." This was said by the president, to applause from the entire chamber. The barber, after a few moments of concentration, declared that he was invested with a public mandate and would not restore peace to Itaguaí before seeing the Casa Verde. This Bastille of human reason, destroyed, an expression he had heard from a local poet, and which he repeated with great emphasis. He said, and at a signal they all went out with him. Imagine the situation of the counselors. It was urgent to prevent the gathering, the rebellion, the fight, the bloodshed. To add to the trouble, one of the counselors who had supported the president, now hearing the name given by the barber to the Casa Verde, Bastille of human reason, found it so elegant that he changed his mind. He said that he thought it would be wise to enact some measure that would reduce Casa Verde. And because the president, indignant, expressed his astonishment in energetic terms, the counselor made this reflection. I have nothing to do with science, but if so many men in whom we assume sane are imprisoned as insane, who can tell us that the insane person is not the alienist? Sebastio Freitas, the dissident counselor, had the gift of gab and spoke for some time with caution, but with firmness. The colleagues were astonished. The president asked that he, at the very least, set an example of order and respect for the law, not to put his ideas out on the streets, so as not to give body and soul to the rebellion, which was for now a whirlwind of scattered atoms. This figure somewhat corrected the effect of the other. Sebastio Freitas promised to suspend any action, reserving the right to request the reduction of Casa Verde through legal means. And he repeated to himself, in love, Bastille of human reason. Meanwhile, the commotion grew. There were no longer 30, but 300 people who accompanied the barber, whose family nickname must be mentioned because it gave its name to the revolt. They called it Kanjika, and the movement became famous under the name of the Kanjika Revolt. The action could be restricted, since many people, either out of fear or out of politeness, did not go out onto the streets. But the feeling was unanimous, or almost unanimous, and the 300 who walked to Casa Verde, given the difference between Paris and Itaguaí, could be compared to those who took the Bastille. Mrs. Evarista had news of the rebellion before she arrived, came to give him one of his offspring. At that time, she was trying on a silk dress, one of the 37 she had brought from Rio de Janeiro, and she couldn't believe it. It must be some kind of mess, she said, changing the position of a pin. Benedetta, see if the bar is good. Okay, Mrs., replied the maid, squatting on the floor, okay. Mrs. turns a little. Like this. It's very good. It's not a feast, no, ma'am. They are shouting. Death to Dr. Bacamarte. The tyrant, said the scared boy. Shut up, you idiot. Benedetta, look there on the left side. Doesn't it look like the stitching is a little skewed? The blue stripe does not continue all the way down. It's really ugly like this. You have to unstitch it to make it look exactly the same, and death to Dr. Bacamarte. Death to the tyrant. Howled 300 voices outside. It was a rebellion that ended on Rua Nova. Mrs. Evarista was left without a drop of blood. At first he didn't take a step. He didn't make a gesture. Terror petrified her. The maid instinctively ran to the back door. As for the boy, whom Mrs. Evarista had not believed, he had a moment of triumph, a certain sudden, imperceptible, deep-seated movement of moral satisfaction when he saw that reality had come to swear by him. Death to the alienist, shouted the voices closer by. Mrs. Evarista, although she could not easily resist the emotions of pleasure, knew how to deal with moments of danger. Didn't faint, ran to the inner room where her husband was studying. When she entered there, in a hurry, the illustrious doctor was scrutinizing a text by Ava Rose. His eyes, clouded by cogitation, rose from the book to the ceiling and fell from the ceiling to the book, blind to external reality, clear to the deep mental workings. Mrs. Evarista called her husband twice, without him paying any attention. On the third, he listened and asked what he had, if he was sick. "Don't you hear those screams?" asked the worthy wife in tears. The alienist then answered. The screams were approaching, terrible, threatening. He understood everything. He got up from the high-backed chair he was sitting in, closed the book, and with a firm and calm step, went to place it on the shelf. As the introduction of the volume somewhat disconcerted the line of the two contiguous volumes, Simão Bacamarte took care to correct this minor, and, by the way, interesting defect. Then he told the woman to go to bed and not do anything. No, begged the worthy lady, I want to die by your side. Simão Bacamarte insisted that it was not a case of death, and even if he were, he would demand that he stay in the name of his life. The unfortunate lady bowed her head, obediently and tearfully. "Down with the greenhouse!" shouted the Kanjikas. The alienist walked to the front porch and arrived there just as the rebellion also arrived and stopped in front, with its 300 heads shining with civility and dark with despair. D. They shouted from all sides. Only the figure of the alienist appeared on the balcony. Simão Bacamarte made a sign asking to speak. The rebels covered his voice with shouts of indignation. Then, the barber, waving his hat in order to impose silence on the crowd, managed to quiet his friends and declared to the alienist that he could speak, but added that he should not abuse the patience of the people as he had done until then. "I will say little, or even nothing, if necessary. I want to know first what you asked for." "We ask nothing," replied the barber tremblingly. "We order that the greenhouse be demolished, or at least stripped of the unfortunates who are there." "I don't understand." "You understand well, tyrant. We want to give freedom to the victims of their hatred, whim, greed." The alienist smiled, but the smile of this great man was not something visible to the eyes of the crowd. It was a slight contraction of 2 or 3 muscles, nothing more. He smiled and replied, "Gentlemen, science is a serious matter and deserves to be treated seriously. I do not give reasons for my actions as an alienist to anyone, except to the teachers and a God. If you want to amend the administration of Casa Verde, I am ready to listen to you. But if you demand that I deny myself, you will gain nothing. I could invite some of you, on behalf of the others, to come and see the insane prisoners with me, but I will not do so because it would be giving you reasons for my system, which I will not do to laymen or rebels." The alienist said this, and the crowd was astonished. It was clear that they had not expected so much energy and even less so much serenity. But the astonishment increased when the alienist, courting the crowd with great gravity, turned his back on them and slowly withdrew inside. The barber immediately came to his senses and, waving his hat, invited his friends to the demolition of the Casa Verde. Few and feeble voices responded. It was at that decisive moment that the barber felt the government's ambition dawning within him. It seemed to him then that by demolishing the Casa Verde and overthrowing the influence of the alienist, he would be able to take over the city council, dominate the other authorities, and establish himself as Lord of Itaguaí. For some years, he had been trying to see his name included in the portfolios for the drawing of lots for the councilors, but he was refused because he did not have a position compatible with such an important office. The time was now or never. Besides, he had gone so far in the chaos that defeat would mean prison or perhaps the gallows or exile. Unfortunately, the alienist response had diminished the fury of his followers. The barber, as soon as he realized this, felt a surge of indignation and wanted to shout at them, "Scoundrels! Cowards!" But he restrained himself and broke out in this way. "My friends, let us fight to the end. The salvation of Itaguaí is in your worthy and heroic hands. Let us destroy the prison of your sons and fathers, your mothers and sisters, your relatives and friends, and yourselves. Or you will die on bread and water, perhaps by whip, in the dungeon of that unworthy man." The crowd stirred, murmured, shouted, threatened, and gathered all around the barber. It was the revolt that was coming to its senses from the slight syncope and was threatening to raise the Casa Verde. "Let's go," shouted Porfirio, waving his hat. "Let's go," they all repeated. An incident stopped them. It was a body of dragoons that, marching, was entering Rua Nova. 7. The eunuch and the dragoons arrived in front of the Kanjikas. There was a moment of astonishment. The Kanjikas did not want to believe that the public force had been sent against them, but the barber understood everything and waited. The dragoons stopped. The captain ordered the crowd to disperse. But although one part of them was inclined to do so, the other part strongly supported the barber, whose response consisted in these raised terms: "We will not disperse. If you want our bodies, you can take them, but only the bodies. You will not take our honor, our credit, our rights, and with them the salvation of Itaguaí. Nothing was more imprudent than this response from the barber, and nothing more natural. It was the vertigo of great crises. Perhaps it was also an excess of confidence that the dragoons would abstain from arms, confidence that the captain immediately dispelled, ordering them to charge the Kanjikas. The moment was indescribable. The crowd roared furiously, some, climbing into the windows of the houses or running down the street, managed to escape, but the majority remained, snorting with rage, indignant, encouraged by the barber's exhortation. The defeat of the Kanjikas was imminent, when a third of the dragoons, whatever the reason, the chronicles do not state, suddenly went over to the side of the rebellion. This unexpected reinforcement gave life to the Kanjikas, while at the same time casting discouragement on the ranks of legality. The loyal soldiers did not have the courage to attack their own comrades, and, one by one, they went over to them, so that after a few minutes, the aspect of things was completely different. The captain was on one side, with some people against a compact mass that threatened him with death. There was no way out. He declared himself defeated and handed his sword to the barber. The triumphant revolution did not waste a single minute. It collected the wounded from the nearby houses and led them to the town hall. The people and the troops were fraternizing, cheering the king, the viceroy, Itaguaí, and the illustrious Porfirio. He was in front, wielding his sword so skillfully as if it were just a slightly longer razor. Victory surrounded his forehead with a mysterious halo. The dignity of government was beginning to stiffen his hips. The counselors at the windows, seeing the crowd and the troops, thought that the troops had captured the crowd, and without further examination, they went in and voted on a petition to the viceroy to order a month's pay for the dragoons, whose courage saved Itaguaí from the abyss into which a band of rebels had thrown it. This phrase was proposed by Sebastião Freitas, the dissident counselor, whose defense of the Kanjikas had so scandalized his colleagues. But soon the illusion was shattered. The cheers for the barber, the death for the counselors, and the alienist came to give them news of the sad reality. The president did not lose heart. "Whatever our fate," he said, "let us remember that we are in the service of His Majesty and the people." Sebastião Freitas suggested that the crown and the town could be better served by leaving through the back and going to confer with the judge from outside, but the entire chamber rejected this suggestion. Soon after, the barber, accompanied by some of his lieutenants, entered the council chamber and informed the chamber of his downfall. The chamber did not resist. He surrendered and was sent to jail from there. Then, the barber's friends proposed that he take over the government of the village in the name of His Majesty. Porfiry accepted the task, although he was not unaware, he added, of the thorns it brought. He also said that he could not do without the help of the friends present, to which they readily agreed. The barber came to the window and communicated these resolutions to the people, which the people ratified, acclaiming the barber. This took the title of Protector of the Village in the name of His Majesty and the people. Soon several important orders were issued, official communications from the new government, a detailed exposition to the viceroy, with many protestations of obedience to His Majesty's orders. Finally, a proclamation to the people, short but energetic, Itaguaí. A corrupt and violent chamber conspired against the interests of His Majesty and the people. Public opinion had condemned her. A handful of citizens, strongly supported by His Majesty's brave dragoons, have just ignominiously dissolved it. And by unanimous consensus of the town, I have been entrusted with supreme command, until His Majesty is pleased to order what seems best to His royal service. Itaguaí, I only ask you to surround me with confidence, to help me restore peace in the public treasury, so ruined by the chamber that has now ended up in your hands. Count on my sacrifice, and be sure that the crown will be for us. The protector of the village on behalf of His Majesty and the people Porfirio Caetano das Neves. Everyone noticed the absolute silence of this proclamation about the Casa Verde, and according to some, there could not have been a clearer indication of the barber's dark plans. The danger was all the greater because, in the midst of these serious events, the alienist had put some 7 or 8 people in the Casa Verde, among them 2 ladies, one of the men being related to the protector. It was not a challenge, an intentional act, but everyone interpreted it that way, and the town breathed with hope that the alienist would be in chains within 24 hours and the terrible prison destroyed. The day ended happily. While the herald with the rattle went from corner to corner reciting the proclamation, the people spread out in the streets and swore to die in defense of the illustrious Porfirio. Few cries against the Casa Verde, proof of confidence in the government's action. The barber had a document issued declaring that day a holiday, and entered into negotiations with the vicar to celebrate a Te Deum. So convenient was the conjunction of temporal and spiritual power in his eyes, but Father Lopez openly refused his assistance. In any case, your reverence will not enlist among the enemies of the government? The barber asked, giving him a gloomy expression, to which Father Lopez replied, without answering, "How can I enlist if the new government has no enemies?" The barber smiled. It was the pure truth. Except for the captain, the councilors, and the town's leaders, everyone acclaimed him. Even if the leaders themselves did not acclaim him, they had not come out against him. Not when the mayors failed to come to receive his orders. In general, the families blessed the name of the one who was finally going to free Itaguaí from Casa Verde and the terrible Simão Bacamarte. 8. The anguish of the apothecary 24 hours after the events described in the previous chapter. The barber left the government palace. That was the name given to the town hall, with 2 aides-de-camp, and went to Simão Bacamarte's residence. He was not unaware that it would be more decorous for the government to send for him. However, the fear that the alienist would not obey forced him to appear tolerant and moderate. I cannot describe the apothecary's terror when he heard that the barber was going to the alienist's house. "You're going to arrest him," he thought, and his anguish redoubled. Indeed, the moral torture of the apothecary in those days of revolution exceeds all possible description. Never did a man find himself in a tighter position. The alienist's privation called him to his side. The barber's victory attracted him to the barber. The mere news of the uprising had already shaken his soul, because he knew the unanimous hatred towards the alienist. But the final victory was also the final blow. His wife, a masculine lady and close friend of Mrs. Evarista, said that his place was next to Simão Bacamarte. While his heart cried out to him that the alienist cause was lost, and that no one, by their own act, ties themselves to a corpse. Cato did it. It is true, said Victor Catoni, he thought, remembering some of Father Lopez's usual lectures. But Cato did not tie himself to a defeated cause. He was the defeated cause itself, the cause of the Republic. His act, therefore, was that of a selfish, miserable egoist. My situation is different. However, the woman insisted. Crispin Sores found no other way out of such a crisis than to get sick, declared himself sick, and went to bed. There goes Porfirio to doctor's house. Bacamarte, his wife told him the next day at his bedside, goes accompanied by people. He'll arrest him, thought the apothecary. One idea brings another. The apothecary imagined that once the alienist was arrested, they would also come for him as an accomplice. This idea was the best of the blisters. Crispin Sores got up, said it was okay, that he was going to leave, and despite all the consort's efforts and protests, she got dressed and left. The old chroniclers are unanimous in saying that the certainty that her husband would nobly stand by the alienist's side greatly consoled the apothecary's wife, and they note with great perspicacity the immense moral power of an illusion, because the apothecary walked resolutely to the government palace, not to the alienist's house. When he arrived there, he was surprised not to see the barber, to whom he was going to present his protests of adhesion, having not done so since the previous day due to illness. And he coughed with some difficulty. The high-ranking officials who heard this statement, aware of the apothecary's close relationship with the alienist, understood the importance of the new addition and treated Crispin Sores with great affection. They told him that the barber would not be long. His lordship had gone to Casa Verde on important business, but he did not stay long. They gave him a chair, refreshments, praise. They told him that the cause of the illustrious Porfirio was that of all patriots, to which the apothecary kept repeating that yes, he had never thought of anything else, and that he would have that very thing declared to his majesty. 9. Too beautiful as the alienist did not delay in receiving the barber, declared to him that he had no means of resisting, and therefore was about to obey. He only asked for one thing, that he not be forced to personally witness the destruction of Casa Verde. "Your lordship is mistaken," said the barber after a pause. "You are mistaken in attributing vandalistic intentions to the government. Rightly or wrongly, public opinion believes that most of the lunatics involved are in their right mind, but the government recognizes that the issue is purely scientific and does not consider resolving scientific issues with positions. Furthermore, Casa Verde is a public institution. We accept it as such from the hands of the dissolved chamber. There is, however, an intermediate solution that restores peace to the public spirit." The alienist could barely conceal his astonishment. He confessed that he had expected something else, the destruction of the asylum, his arrest, his exile, everything except. "Your lordship's astonishment," the barber interrupted gravely, "comes from not heeding the government's grave responsibility. The people, seized by a blind pity, which in such a case gives them legitimate indignation, can demand a certain order of acts from the government. But this person, with the responsibility that falls to him, should not practice them, at least not in full, and such is our situation. The generous revolution that yesterday overthrew a vilified and corrupt chamber called loudly for the raising of Casa Verde. But can the government's spirit eliminate the madness? No. And if the government cannot eliminate it, is it at least able to discriminate against it, to recognize it? Neither. It is a matter of science. Therefore, on such a delicate matter, the government cannot, should not, and does not want to dispense with Your Excellency's assistance. What we ask is that we somehow give some satisfaction to the people. Let us unite, and the people will know how to obey. One of the acceptable suggestions, if Your Lordship does not suggest another, would be to remove from the Casa Verde those patients who are almost cured, as well as minor maniacs, etc. In this way, without great danger, we will show some tolerance and kindness." "How many dead and injured were there yesterday in the conflict?" asked Simão Bacamarte after about 3 minutes. The barber was surprised by the question, but quickly replied that there were 11 dead and 25 wounded. 11 dead and 25 wounded, repeated the alienist 2 or 3 times. And then he declared that the idea did not seem good to him, but that he would find another one, and within a few days he would give him an answer. And he asked him several questions about the previous day's successes, attack, defense, adhesion of the dragons, resistance of the chamber, etc., to which the barber responded with great abundance, insisting mainly on the discredit into which the chamber had fallen. The barber confessed that the new government did not yet have the trust of the town's leaders, but the alienist could do a lot on that point. The government, concluded the barber, would be happy if it could count, not on the sympathy, but on the benevolence of the highest spirit of Itaguaí, and certainly of the kingdom. But none of this altered the noble and austere physiognomy of that great man, who listened silently, without vanity or modesty, but impassive as a god of stone. 11 dead and 25 wounded, repeated the alienist, after accompanying the barber to the door. Here are 2 beautiful cases of brain disease. The symptoms of duplicity and shamelessness of this barber are positive. As for the foolishness of those who acclaimed him, no other proof is needed than the 11 dead and 25 wounded. 2 beautiful cases. Long live the illustrious Porfirio, shouted about 30 people who were waiting for the barber at the door. The alienist looked through the window and still heard this remainder of a short speech by the barber to the 30 people who were acclaiming him. "Because I watch, you can be sure of that. I watch over the execution of the people's will. Trust in me, and everything will be done in the best way. I only recommend you order. Order, my friends, is the basis of government. Long live the illustrious Porfirio," shouted the 30 voices, waving their hats. 2 beautiful cases, muttered the alienist. The asylum. Within 5 days, the alienist placed around 50 supporters of the new government in the Casa Verde. The people were outraged. The government, flustered, did not know how to react. João Pina, another barber, openly said in the streets that Porfirio was sold for Simão Bacamarte's gold, a phrase that brought together the most resolute people in the town around Joaquim. Porfirio, seeing his old rival with the razor at the forefront of the insurrection, understood that his loss was irreparable if he did not strike a great blow. Issued two decrees, one abolishing Casa Verde, the other banishing the alienist. Joaquim clearly showed, with great phrases, that Porfirio's act was a simple apparatus, a deception, in which the people should not believe. 2 hours later, Porfirio fell ignominiously, and Joaquim took on the difficult task of government. As he found in the drawers the minutes of the proclamation, the presentation to the viceroy, and other inaugural acts of the previous government, he rushed to have them copied and sent. The chroniclers add, and it is also understood, that he changed their names, and where the other barber had spoken of a corrupt chamber, this one spoke of an intruder infected with bad French doctrines, and contrary to the sacrosanct interests of His Majesty, etc. At this point, a force sent by the viceroy entered the town and restored order. The alienist immediately demanded the handover of the barber Porfirio, as well as that of some 50 or so individuals, whom he declared to be imbeciles. And not only did they give him these, they also promised to give him 19 more of the barber's followers, who were recovering from the wounds they had received in the first rebellion. This point in the Itaguaí crisis also marks the maximum degree of Simão Bacamarte's influence. Whatever he wanted, he was given. And one of the most vivid proofs of the power of the illustrious doctor is found in the readiness with which the counselors, returned to their places, agreed that Sebastio Freitas should also be taken to the hospice. The alienist, knowing the extraordinary inconsistency of this counselor's opinions, understood that it was a pathological case and asked. The same thing happened with the apothecary. The alienist, since he was told about Crispim Sor's momentary support for the Canjicas rebellion, compared it to the approval he had always received from him, even the day before, and ordered his capture. Crispim Sors did not deny the fact, but explained it by saying that he had given in to a movement of terror upon seeing the triumphant rebellion, and gave as proof the absence of any other act on his part, adding that he had immediately returned to bed, Illinois. Simão Bacamarte did not contradict him. He told those present, however, that terror is also the father of madness, and that the case of Crispim Sors seemed to him to be one of the most characteristic. But the most evident proof of Simão Bacamarte's influence was the docility with which the chamber handed over its own president to him. This worthy magistrate had declared in full session that he was not content to wash away the affront of the Canjicas with less than 30 almudes of blood, word that reached the alienist's ears through the mouth of the chamber secretary, excited by such energy. Simão Bacamarte began by putting the secretary in the Casa Verde, and went from there to the chamber, where he declared that the president was suffering from bull dementia, a type that he intended to study, with great benefit for the people. The chamber hesitated at first, but eventually gave in. From then on it was a frantic collection. A man could not give birth or spread to the simplest lie in the world, even one that benefits the inventor or disseminator, without being immediately thrown in the Casa Verde. It was all madness. The enigma lovers, the makers of charades, the anagrammers, the gossips, the curious about other people's lives, those who put all their care into their trickery, the occasional puffed-up swindler, no one escaped the alienist's emissaries. He respected his girlfriends and did not spare his flirts, saying that the former gave in to a natural impulse, and the latter to an addiction. Whether a man was miserly or prodigal, he went to the greenhouse in the same way. Hence the claim that there was no rule for complete sanity. Some chroniclers believe that Simão Bacamarte did not always act with integrity, and cite in support of this statement, which I do not know if it can be accepted, the fact that he obtained a ruling from the chamber authorizing the use of a silver ring on the thumb of the left hand to any person who, without other documentary or traditional proof, declare to have 2 or 3 ounces of Gothic blood in their veins. These chroniclers say that the secret purpose of the insinuation to the chamber was to enrich a goldsmith, his friend and compadre. But Although it is true that the goldsmith saw his business prosper after the new municipal order, it is no less true that this stance gave Casa Verde a multitude of tenants. Therefore, one cannot define, without temerity, the true end of the illustrious doctor. As for the determining reason for the capture and retirement in Casa Verde of all those who used the ring, it is one of the most obscure points in the history of Itaguaí. The most likely opinion is that they were arrested for gesticulating aimlessly in the streets, at home, in church. No one ignores that crazy people gesticulate a lot. In any case, it is a simple conjecture. There is nothing positive. Where will this man end up? Said the chief men of the land. If we had supported the Kanjikas. One morning, the day the council was supposed to hold a grand ball, the entire town was shaken by the news that the alienist's own wife had been thrown into the greenhouse. Nobody believed it. It must have been some kid's invention. And it wasn't. It was the pure truth. Mrs. Evarista had been picked up at 2 o'clock at night. Father Lopez ran to the alienist and discreetly questioned him about the fact. "I've suspected it for some time now," said the husband gravely. The modesty with which she had lived in both marriages could not be reconciled with the frenzy for silks, velvets, lace, and precious stones that she displayed as soon as she returned from Rio de Janeiro. Since then, I started to observe her. Their conversations were all about these objects. If I spoke to him about ancient courts, he would immediately inquire about the shape of the ladies' dresses. If a lady visited her in my absence, before telling me the purpose of her visit, she would describe her attire to me, approving some things and criticizing others. One day, I believe your reverence will remember, he proposed to make a dress for the image of Our Lady of the main church every year. These were all serious symptoms. Tonight, however, total dementia was declared. I had prepared and decorated the clothes I would wear to the town hall ball. I only hesitated between a garnet necklace and a sapphire necklace. The day before yesterday, he asked me which one I would take. I replied that one or the other would suit her. Yesterday, he repeated the question at lunch. Shortly after dinner, I found her quiet and thoughtful. "What's wrong?" I asked him. "I want to wear the garnet necklace, but I think the sapphire one is so beautiful." "Then take the sapphire one." But where is the one in Granada?" Anyway, the afternoon passed without any news. We had supper and went to bed. Late at night, it would be 1:30. I wake up and don't see her. I get up, go to the dressing room, and find her in front of the 2 necklaces, trying them on in the mirror, now one, now the other. The dementia was evident. I picked her up immediately. Father Lopez was not satisfied with the answer, but he did not object at all. The alienist, however, realized and explained to him that Mrs. Evarista's case was one of sumptuous mania, not incurable, and in any case worthy of study. "I expect to have her well within 6 weeks," he concluded. The selflessness of the illustrious doctor gave him great prominence. Conjectures, inventions, suspicions, everything fell to the ground, since he did not hesitate to take his own wife, whom he loved with all the strength of his soul, to Casa Verde. No one else had the right to resist him, still less to attribute to him intentions unrelated to science. He was a great, austere man, Hippocrates dressed as Cato. 11. The astonishment of Itaguaí, and now the reader should prepare himself for the same astonishment that the town felt when it learned one day that the madmen of Casa Verde were all going to be thrown out on the street. All of them. Everyone. It's impossible. Some, yes, but all. Everyone. This is what he said in the letter he sent to the chamber this morning. In fact, the alienist had written to the chamber stating, first, that he had verified from the statistics of the town and Casa Verde that 4/5 of the population were retired in that establishment. Second, that this population displacement had led him to examine the foundations of his theory of brain diseases, a theory that excluded from the domain of reason all cases in which the balance of faculties was not perfect and absolute. Third, that from this examination and from statistical fact he had come to the conviction that the true doctrine was not that one, but the opposite, and therefore that the imbalance of faculties should be admitted as normal and exemplary, and as pathological hypotheses all cases in which that balance was uninterrupted. Fourth, that in view of this, he declared to the chamber that he would grant freedom to the prisoners of Casa Verde In shelter, they're the people who found themselves in the conditions now described. Fifth, that, in trying to discover scientific truth, he would spare no effort of any kind, expecting the same dedication from the chamber. Sixth, which returned to the chamber and to private individuals the sum of the stipend received for the accommodation of the supposedly insane, minus the part actually spent on food, clothing, etc., that the chamber would order to be checked in the books and coffers of the Casa Verde. Itaguai's astonishment was great. The relatives and friends of the prisoners were no less happy. Dinners, dances, lights, music, there was everything to celebrate such a magnificent event. I do not describe the parties because they are not relevant to our purpose, but they were splendid, touching, and prolonged. And so human things go. Amidst the joy produced by Simão Bacamarte's work, no one noticed in the final sentence of Section 4, a sentence full of future 12. The end of Section 4 degrees the lights went out. Families were reconstituted. Everything seemed to be back on track. Order reigned. The chamber once again exercised government, without any external pressure. The president himself and Councillor Freitas returned to their seats. The barber Porfirio, taught by events, having tasted everything, as the poet said of Napoleon, and then some, because Napoleon did not taste the Casa Verde, the barber found the obscure glory of the razor and scissors preferable to the brilliant calamities of power, was, it is true, prosecuted, but the people of the village begged his majesty for clemency, hence the forgiveness. João Pina was acquitted, given that he had defeated a rebel. Chroniclers think that this is the origin of our adage. A thief who steals from a thief is forgiven for 100 years. An immoral adage, it is true, but a very useful one that not only did the complaints against the alienist end, but there was no resentment left for the acts he had committed, adding that the inmates of Casa Verde, since he declared them fully sane, felt filled with profound recognition and fervent enthusiasm. Many understood that the alienist deserved a special demonstration, and they gave him a ball, which was followed by other balls and dinners. Chronicles say that Mrs. Evarista initially had the idea of separating from her husband, but the pain of losing the company of such a great man overcame any resentment of self-love, and the couple became even happier than before. The friendship between the alienist and the apothecary was no less intimate. He concluded from Simão Bacamarte's work that prudence is the first virtue in times of revolution, and he greatly appreciated the magnanimity of the alienist who, in giving him freedom, extended the hand of an old friend. He is a great man, he said to his wife, referring to that circumstance. There is no need to mention the Sadler, Costa, Qualo, Martin Brito, and others, specially named in this writing. Suffice it to say that they were able to freely exercise their previous habits. Martin Brito himself, imprisoned for a speech in which he had emphatically praised Mrs. Evarista, now made another in honor of the distinguished doctor, whose most elevated genius, raising its wings far above the sun, left all other spirits on earth beneath it. I appreciate your words, replied the alienist, and I still do not regret having restored him to freedom. However, the chamber, which had responded to Simão Bacamarte's letter, with the reservation that it would issue a ruling in due course regarding the end of Section 4, finally decided to legislate on it. A position was adopted, without debate, authorizing the alienists to accommodate people who were in perfect balance of mental faculties in the Casa Verde. And because the chamber's experience had been painful, it established the clause that the authorization was provisional, limited to 1 year, for the purpose of testing the new psychological theory, and the chamber could, even before that period, order the closure of Casa Verde if it were advised to do so for reasons of public order. Councillor Freitas also proposed a declaration that under no circumstances would councillors be sent to the mental asylum, a clause that was accepted, voted on, and included in the regulation, despite complaint from Councillor Galvio. The main argument of this magistrate is that the chamber, legislating on a scientific experiment, could not exclude the people of its members from the consequences of the law. The exception was hateful and ridiculous. As soon as he had uttered these harsh words, The counselors broke out into loud cries against the audacity and foolishness of their colleague. However, he listened to them and limited himself to saying that he voted against the exception. The council, he concluded, does not give us any special power, nor does it eliminate us from the human spirit. Simão Bacamarte accepted the position with all the restrictions. As for the exclusion of the counselors, he declared that he would feel deeply sorry if he were compelled to take them to Casa Verde. The clause, however, was the best proof that they did not suffer from the perfect balance of mental faculties. The same did not happen to Counselor Galvio, whose correctness in the objection he made, and whose moderation in the response given to the invectives of his colleagues showed a well-organized brain on his part. Therefore, he asked the chamber to hand it over to him. The chamber, feeling even more aggravated by Counselor Galvio's actions, considered the alienist request and voted unanimously for the delivery. It is understood that, according to the new theory, a suit or a saying was not enough to take someone to Casa Verde. A long examination was needed, a vast investigation of the past and the present. Father Lopez, for example, was only captured 30 days after the incident, the apothecary's wife 40 days. The seclusion of this lady filled the consort with indignation. Crispin Soares left the house foaming with rage and declaring to the people he met that he was going to tear off the tyrant's ears. A man, an opponent of the alienist, hearing this news on the street, forgot his reasons for dissent and ran to Simão Bacamarte's house to tell him of the danger he was in. Simão Bacamarte showed himself grateful for his opponent's behavior, and a few minutes were enough for him to recognize the rectitude of his feelings, his good faith, his human respect, his generosity. He shook his hands tightly and took him to the greenhouse. "A case like this is rare," he said to the astonished woman. "Now let's wait for our Crispin." Crispin Soares entered. Pain had overcome anger. The apothecary did not tear off the alienist's ears. This consoled his privy, assuring him that he was not a lost cause. Perhaps the woman had some brain damage. I would examine it very carefully, but before that I couldn't leave her on the street. And since it seemed advantageous to him to bring them together, because the husband's cunning and roguery could in some way cure the moral beauty he had discovered in his wife, Simão Bacamarte said, "You will work during the day in the pharmacy, but you will have lunch and dinner with your wife, and you will spend the nights, Sundays, and holy days here." The proposal placed the poor apothecary in the situation of Buridan's donkey. He wanted to live with his wife, but he was afraid of returning to Casa Verde, and he was in that fight for some time, until Mrs. Everesta got him out of the difficulty, promising that she would take care of seeing her friend and passing on messages from one to the other. Crispin Soares kissed his hands gratefully. This last flash of pusillanimous selfishness seemed sublime to the alienist. After 5 months, about 18 people were housed, but Simão Bacamarte did not slack off. "I went from street to street, from house to house, spying, questioning, studying. And when he picked up a sick person, he took him away with the same joy with which he had once gathered them by the dozens." This same disproportion confirmed the new theory. The true brain pathology had finally been found. One day, he managed to place the judge from outside in the Casa Verde, but he proceeded with such scrupulousness that he did so only after thoroughly studying all his actions and questioning the town's chief men. More than once, he was on the verge of collecting perfectly unbalanced people. This is what happened to a lawyer, in whom he recognized such a set of moral and mental qualities that it was dangerous to leave him on the street. He ordered his arrest, but the agent, suspicious, asked him to do an experiment. He went to a friend, sued for a false will, and advised him to take Celestiano as his lawyer, was the name of the person in question. "So it seems, without a doubt. Go, confess everything, the whole truth, whatever it may be, and entrust the case to him." The man went to the lawyer, confessed to having forged the will, and ended up asking him to take on his case. The lawyer did not refuse. He studied the papers, reasoned at length, and proved in every light that the will was more than true. The defendant's innocence was solemnly proclaimed by the judge, and the inheritance passed through his hands. The distinguished jurisconsult owed his freedom to this experience. But nothing escapes an original and penetrating spirit. Simão Bacamarte, who had been noticing the zeal, sagacity, patience, and moderation of that agent for some time, recognized the skill and tact with which he had carried out such a delicate and complicated experiment, and decided to take him immediately to Casa Verde. Gave him, however, one of the best cubicles. The alienated were housed by classes. A gallery of modest people was created, that is, the madmen in whom this moral perfection predominated, another of tolerant, another of truthful, another of simple, another of loyal, another of magnanimous, another of sagacious, another of sincere, etc. Naturally, the families and friends of the prisoners cried out against the theory, and some tried to compel the council to revoke the license. The chamber, however, had not forgotten the language of Councilor Galvio, and if it revoked the license, it would see him on the street and return to his place. Therefore, he refused. Simão Bacamarte wrote to the councilors, not thanking them, but congratulating them for this act of personal revenge. Disillusioned with the legality, some of the town's leaders secretly turned to the barber Porfirio and promised him all the support of people, money, and influence in the court if he would put himself at the head of another movement against the council and the alienists. The barber answered them no, that ambition had led him the first time to transgress the laws, but that he had amended his decision, recognizing his own error and the lack of consistency in the opinion of his followers, that the chamber had decided to authorize the alienist's new experiment for 1 year. He had to either wait for the deadline to end or request it from the viceroy if the chamber rejected the request. He would never advise the use of a resource that he saw fail in his hands, and that at the cost of deaths and injuries that would be his eternal remorse. "What are you telling me?" asked the alienist when a secret agent told him about the barber's conversation with the town's leaders. 2 days later, the barber was taken to Casa Verde. "Arrested for having a dog, arrested for not having a dog," exclaimed the unfortunate man. "The deadline has come, and the chamber has authorized an additional 6-month period for testing therapeutic methods." The outcome of this episode of Itaguai's Chronicle is so great and so unexpected that it deserved no less than 10 chapters of exposition. But I will content myself with one, which will be the conclusion of the narrative and one of the most beautiful examples of scientific conviction and human selflessness. Très plus tard. It was time for therapy. Simão Bacamarte, active and sagacious in discovering the sick, went even further in the diligence and penetration with which he began to treat them. On this point, all the chroniclers are in full agreement. The illustrious alienist performed astonishing cures, which aroused the most lively admiration in Itaguaí. Indeed, it was difficult to imagine a more rational therapeutic system, since the madmen were divided into classes, according to the moral perfection that each of them had over the others. Simão Bacamarte took care to attack the predominant quality head-on. Let's suppose a modest one. He applied medication that could instill in her the opposite feeling, and he did not immediately go for the maximum doses. He graduated them, according to the patient's condition, age, temperament, and social position. Sometimes a coat, a ribbon, a wig, a cane were enough to restore reason to the insane. In other cases, the disease was more rebellious, then resorted to diamond rings, honorary distinctions, etc. There was a patient, a poet, who resisted everything. Simão Bacamarte was beginning to despair of a cure when he had the idea of sending Matraca running in order to proclaim him as a rival of Garceo and Pindaro. It was a miracle cure, the unfortunate man's mother told a godmother. It was a miracle cure. Another patient, also modest, opposed the same rebellion to the medication. But not being a writer, he barely knew how to sign his name. The remedy of the rattle could not be applied to him. Simão Bacamarte remembered to ask him for the position of Secretary of the Academy of the Hidden established in Itaguaí. The positions of president and secretaries were royal appointments, by special grace of the late King João V, and implied the title of excellency and the use of a gold plate on the hat. The Lisbon government rejected the diploma, but representing the alienist who was not asking for it as an honorary prize or legitimate distinction, and only as a therapeutic means for a difficult case, the government exceptionally gave in to the plea. And even so, he did not do so without extraordinary effort from the Minister of the Navy and Overseas, who happened to be a cousin of the insane man. It was another holy remedy. It really is admirable, they said in the streets, upon seeing the healthy and puffed-up expressions of the two former lunatics. Such was the system. Imagine the rest. Every moral or mental beauty was attacked at the point where perfection seemed most solid, and the effect was certain. It wasn't always right. There were cases where the predominant quality resisted everything. Then, the alienist attacked another part, applying to therapy the method of military strategy, which takes a fortress from one point if it cannot be achieved from another. At the end of 5.5 months, Casa Verde was empty, all healed. Counselor Galvillo, so cruelly afflicted with moderation and equity, had the good fortune to lose an uncle. I say happiness, because the uncle left an ambiguous will, and he obtained a good interpretation, corrupting the judges and confusing the other heirs. The alienist's sincerity was evident in this move. He naively confessed that he had no part in the cure. It was the simple vis medicatrix of nature. The same did not happen with Father Lopez. Knowing that the alienist was completely ignorant of Hebrew and Greek, he tasked him with making a critical analysis of the Septuagint version. The priest accepted the task, and he did so at the right time. After 2 months, I had a book and my freedom. As for the lady of the apothecary, she did not stay long in the cell she was assigned, and where she was not lacking in affection. "Why doesn't Crispin come visit me?" she said every day. They answered him now one thing, now another. After all, they told him the whole truth. The worthy matron could not contain her indignation and shame. In the outbursts of anger, loose and vague expressions escaped him, such as these: scoundrel, scoundrel, ungrateful, a scoundrel who has built houses at the expense of fake and rotten ointments. Scoundrel. Simão Bacamarte warned that, even if the accusation contained in these words was not true, they were enough to show that the excellent lady was finally restored to the perfect imbalance of her faculties, and promptly discharged him. Now, if you imagine that the alienist was overjoyed to see the last guest leave Casa Verde, you show that you still don't know our man. Produzulta was their motto. It was not enough for him to have discovered the true theory of madness. He was not content with having established the reign of reason in Itaguaí. Produzulta. He was not happy. He was worried, thoughtful. Something told him that the new theory had, within itself, another and very new theory. Let's see, he thought. Let's see if I finally reach the ultimate truth. He said this, walking around the vast room, where the richest library in His Majesty's overseas domains shone. A wide damask dressing gown, tied at the waist by a silk cord, with gold tassels, a gift from a university, enveloped the majestic and austere body of the illustrious alienist. His hair covered a large and noble bald spot acquired in his daily scientific thoughts. The feet, not slender and feminine, not large and wiggly, but proportionate to the figure, were protected by a pair of shoes whose buckles were nothing more than simple and modest brass. See the difference. Luxury was only noticeable in that which was of scientific origin. What actually came from him bore the color of moderation and simplicity, virtues so suited to the person of a wise man. That was how he went, the great alienist, from one end of the vast library to the other, withdrawn into himself, a stranger to all things other than the dark problem of brain pathology. Suddenly it stopped, standing before a window, with his left elbow resting on his open right hand and his chin on his closed left hand. He asked himself, but were they really mad, and were they cured by me, or was what seemed to be a cure nothing more than the discovery of the perfect imbalance of the brain? And digging down, here is the result he arrived at. The well-organized brains he had just cured were just as unbalanced as the others. Yes, he said to himself, I cannot claim to have instilled in them a new feeling or faculty. One and the other thing existed in a latent state, but they existed. Arriving at this conclusion, the illustrious alienist had two contrary sensations, one of joy, the other of dejection. The joy was in seeing that after long and patient investigations, constant work, and an enormous struggle with the people, I could affirm this truth. There were no madmen in Itaguaí. Itaguaí did not have a single idiot. But as quickly as this idea had refreshed his soul, another appeared which neutralized the first effect. Was the idea of doubt. What the hell? Wouldn't Itaguaí have a single concerted brain? Wouldn't this absolute conclusion be erroneous for that very reason? And would it not therefore destroy the broad and majestic edifice of the new psychological doctrine? The affliction of the distinguished Simão Bacamarte is defined by Itaguaí chroniclers as one of the most terrifying moral storms that have fallen upon man. But storms only terrify the weak. The strong stiffen against them and gaze at the thunder. 20 minutes later, the alienist's face lit up with a soft light. Yes, that must be it, he thought. That's it. Simão Bacamarte found in himself the characteristics of perfect mental and moral balance. It seemed to him that he possessed sagacity, patience, perseverance, tolerance, truthfulness, moral vigor, loyalty, all the qualities that can form a complete idiot. He doubted immediately, it's true, and came to the conclusion that it was an illusion. But being a prudent man, he decided to call a council of friends, whom he questioned frankly. The opinion was affirmative. No defects? None, said the assembly in chorus. No biases? Nothing. Everything perfect? All. No, impossible, cried the alienist. I say that I do not feel within myself that superiority that I have just seen defined with such magnificence. Friendliness is what makes you talk. I study myself, and I find nothing that justifies the excesses of your kindness. The assembly insisted. The alienist resisted. Finally, Father Lopez explained everything with his concept worthy of an observer. Do you know why you don't see your high qualities, which we all admire? It is because it still has a quality that highlights the others. Modesty. It was decisive. Simão Bacamarte bowed his head, both happy and sad, and even happier than sad. Immediately afterwards, he retreated to Casa Verde. In vain did his wife and friends tell him to stay, for he was perfectly sane and balanced. Neither entreaties, nor suggestions, nor tears stopped him for a single instant. The question is scientific, he said. This is a new doctrine, the first example of which is me. I bring together theory and practice within myself. Simon, Simon, my love, his wife said to him, her face bathed in tears. But the illustrious doctor, his eyes lit by scientific conviction, turned a deaf ear to his wife's longing and gently pushed her away. Once the door to Casa Verde was closed, he devoted himself to studying and healing himself. Chroniclers say that he died 17 months later, in the same state he had entered, without having been able to achieve anything. Some go so far as to conjecture that there was never another madman besides him in Itaguaí. But this opinion, founded on a rumor that has been circulating since the alienist expired, has no other proof than the rumor, and a dubious rumor, since it is attributed to Father Lopez, who had so passionately highlighted the qualities of the great man. In any case, the burial was carried out with great pomp and rare solemnity. The end.